Good evening. My name is Lynn Brown, and I'm head of the John Brademas Center at NYU, which is so pleased to bring you this conversation tonight. My role is simple and brief: to set the stage about the Civility Project and then turn over the proceedings to our informed and interesting panelists. This is the fifth and final in a series of engagements extending back over the last year and a half on the topic broadly of civility. Now, one must acknowledge at the outset that the term and concept itself of civility can be a slippery one and hard to pin down, depending on who is invoking it and to what end. So in that spirit, our very first event confronted that fact head on and was entitled Interrogating Civility, and being able to ask, is civility always a good thing? Whom does its exercise benefit, and whom does it harm or silence? What are its possibilities and its limits? In the second conversation, we turn to the role of civility in the political realm. Very relevant as we meet today. How important is it in the guiding of political debate and behavior? What role does it play in the functioning of our political institutions and in the very protection of democratic norms? Our third event tried to locate the place of civility in efforts to achieve social and racial justice. In this context, confronting the status quo or trying to bring about social change, the role of civility can be more complex. Our calls for civility and civil discourse merely an excuse to ask people to remain silent or polite in the face of injustice. The fourth conversation confronted a possible culprit in the erosion of civility, and that is advances in technology, and particularly the rise of social media. Combined with the decline in local and community-based news sources, are we now in a place where the loudest and angriest and meanest among us control the floor, so to speak? And so we come to tonight's topic, the lessons and challenges for civility from the perspective of differing actors occupying sectors outside politics or advocacy movements, namely perspectives from religion, higher education, film, storytelling, poetry and the arts, and even comedy. What can we learn from these vantage points about how to navigate conflict, embrace differences, and create community? The Brademas Center has taken on this project because of our mission and our legacy, named after John Brademas, who was for 22 years a member of the United States Congress and then became president of New York University. In Washington, John could be a fierce and partisan advocate for the causes he believed in, but he was deeply devoted to the legislative process and the prospect that seasoned and reasoned discourse could prevail across a wide political spectrum. And he brought that perspective with him as president of NYU, thinking there was a special role for universities to play in that space. So I just want to do a few thank yous to the J.M. Kaplan Fund and members of the Advisory Council of the Brademas Center, whose generous financial support helps fund this project. Ellen Toscano, one of the members of our council, has been a mainstay in helping us conceptualize this project and line up speakers, and has worked very hard along with the center's senior director, Michael Donicia, to plan and operationalize these 5 events. And also a thank you to Nessa Rappaport, Tom McIntyre, and Polly Terzian, all who make it happen. And now I'd like to turn over the proceedings to tonight's moderator, Dr. Hossein Rashid, who will introduce the other panelists and lead off the discussion. Dr. Rashid is Assistant Dean for Religion and Public Life and a lecturer at Harvard Divinity School. He has worked with a variety of foundations, nonprofits, and government agencies who have reached out to him for his expertise in religion, and his work explores the interaction between culture and religion and the role of the arts in conflict mediations. With that, I now turn it over to Hussein, who will lead the rest of the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this evening. Greetings of peace to all of you. I am humbled to be in community and on a panel with Ricardo Maldonado and Katie Borum. I'll introduce them a little bit more fully before they begin their comments. But for those of you who are interested in complete and full bios, we have put a link to their bios in our chat, so please make sure you look at them and get a sense of the wisdom and knowledge and care they bring to this topic. I also want to remind those of you who are audience members that we are taking Q&A through the Q&A button on the bottom row of your Zoom panel. So if you just click there and drop in your Q&A, somebody will be moderating those and bring them to our attention towards the end of the formal remarks for the panel. In terms of civility, Lynn has walked us through really the arc of what the civility series is meant to be about. Today's is lessons and challenges for civility from civil society. And when I was first approached by Michael to moderate this panel, I had to figure out what civility meant, because civility, as I understand it now, is a tool for discipline. It's a tool for keeping conversations from happening. It's about tone policing and saying, I can't believe you said something in that way. Rather than engaging with content, is engaging with the way people feel about what they're hearing, not actually the content of what they're hearing. Coming from academia, I think a parallel to collegiality that to civility that we often engage with is collegiality. Is this person somebody I want to work with? And this too is a form of policing and disciplining. And knowing what the Brademas Center stands for, I said, this is not what they're looking for. This is not how they're coming to civility. So what is civility? And I turned to my trusty guidebook for thinking big thoughts about big terms. And I turned to Raymond Williams' book, Keywords, for those of you who are familiar with it. I turned to this book for his definition of what civility means. And interestingly enough, in his entire volume, where he offers histories and delves into the complexities of the origin of words that define our world in the modern period, civility is not there. Civil is not there. What he provides is a definition of civilization. And coming from the same root, I think it's appropriate to come through civilization. What is civilization built on? What is the civil that is part of civility, that is part of civil society? And two elements of his approach to civilization leapt out at me. The first is that it's related to citizenship. How do we belong together? How do we build this community in a formal and structured way? And then he talks about social order and the ways that civility helps generate a social order and how social order helps generate civility. And I think it is often the latter, the social order part that leans into disciplining, that has irked me about civility in the last several years. But coming at it through Williams' talk and trying to understand, coming at it through Williams' definition and trying to understand what Brademas Center is trying to do, what I think the Brademas Center is trying to do, is thinking about civility as a form of relationality, of shared obligations, and of common commitments. This is the citizenship aspect. This is the basic social order. This is the social contract, if you will. Civility is an expression of that. But that doesn't mean we always have to agree. It's also about disagreement. But how do we disagree with common form, with common assumptions, with common forms in ways that are constructive rather than inherently divisive? And I think that that's what civility calls us to a certain extent, is not to agreement, but the ability to live in disagreement and the ability to understand that we can build out of that disagreement still. So with that, and those reflections, I want to turn to our panelists, really who you're here to hear from. I just get the privilege of setting them up, I hope. But we have two really powerful panelists for you today. I will introduce them in their speaking order. So first is Ricardo Maldonado, who's president of the Academy of American Poets. And second is Katie Borum, who is the co-founder and co-director of the Yes and Laughter Lab, which is affiliated and connected with American University, where she's also a faculty member. With that, I will turn it over to two smarter people than myself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rashid. Good evening, buenas noches. Your listening is a kindness, and I thank you for this invitation. What I propose to share or land upon for the time being came with a thundering force to me at a literature conference by the end of the summer. It was not granting text, but granting, it feels like, was an object of aspiration to all my activities. I put stock in the potential of generosity. I am, as you know already, Ricardo Maldonado, a poet, of course, a translator from Puerto Rico, and the president of an academy. These substantives grant me allegiances to architecture, physical, digital, communal, and a certain quality of giving toward community. I have accrued value to them, accrued so as to make a living of my intersections and meditate for them a project, a life assignment. It concerns me, a reading of civility and the question of literature as they come to my life, that in words my humanity chanced upon me even when young, and that in reading I found conspiracy for a living. For the purposes of tonight's conversation, I have made myself a case study or a study of a case on how civility could play out and why. I don't propose to answer the challenges of now, but to live perhaps in a kind of possibility that we could be attuned in our collective listening. In any case, I want to give you something along the lines of I am bringing the essence of myself when gives on occasion of a chance meeting, sensing familiarity like a swan made out of felt, like Neruda would have it, to give you an image of the thing that you may consume, lest it consume me, that I could be one of many. Therefore, let me translate the atmosphere of my beginning some 40 or so years back. I was raised in Guaynabo, Puerto Rico. That is a name that is popularly said to mean in Taino, here is another place of fresh water. And by fresh water in a literal sense, I grew up with three siblings, two parents, one a lawyer who never practiced, the other a sales manager for GE who was beloved till he died, and after he was loved, I was 18. Home was a house made of cement with windows and doors, and outside my mother's trees. Home was the locks that made it. That is, home was felt. It had a loving geometry, but home had a perimeter, therefore citizenship and praxis, which we can translate into belonging. And home kept up during Maria, and that's how my family survived a tempest. Without power for 3 months, a relatively short sentence by the standards of recovery, short but endured nonetheless. I was in New York when my family had something sturdy to hold against the weather, and outside there was wind. Then the radio stations gave out to the locomotive in the air and the power went out. It was 5 a.m., rainwater filtering in enough to make them fear. And afterwards, a neighbor looped a cord to my mother's fridge to keep things fresh to consume. And they had a kind of power not many had before light would come to the archipelago of Puerto Rico. Here, light does not translate into power. And my people hungered in their eyes and in their bellies. They hungered. But America sent cameras because here was a document of horror to translate and file into an archive. Once asked to take remedial English, twice in Brooklyn, I was labeled spick. That charge in the tongue I did poems with, as I wrote in English, since I chanced upon housemates to an athlete dying young, gave shape to the performance of civility. in corduroy and slacks and in my Converse shoes. I was, I believe, subject to an American dissertation of which I was, among many things, a reader. I was Ricardo. I sat, I observed, I felt the blunt end, and it conquered me. Spick, they called me on the F train. And Spick also in Park Slope, but that was later. It was not imprecise to suggest I had lost value and was therefore untranslated into the book of the city. I administered to instead my living. Oh, how we devastate with regret. I measured myself that time with a pound of sorrow. That night for me, the great American century perished, but I kept to my living between stations under the surface. For I work in literature, and I had made it, of course, in New York. The power of literature resides in collective inquiry. I was a teacher in my time nearly 20 years ago, that to be a writer felt one had to teach, and to teach one must understand the poem to give shape to what was previous and unsayable. I added that to the curriculum. The moment of composition, I guessed, was a mercy to be made possible in words. And so I instructed that project of literature felt as such, to know by faith that we are not alone, that we have made ourselves legible to the project of ourselves. We dreamt ourselves in our literatures forward. It was my writer's temperament that sought to loosely reference Heaney's naming at the Nobel, to seek devotion to things, to spell corroboration to what was going on in the suspension between the archaic and the modern, as Heaney termed his youth, that we are all participants in the human project. Power, of course, legislates, as it is wont to do. Foreign to the United States in a domestic sense, pronounced Justice Henry Brown about Puerto Rico at the Supreme Court in 1901. This was, we nationally swear, a judicial clarification. What concerns me now as a poet and a representative of poets is how the law translates subjects to collective sovereignty. In literature, we would label the activity and advancement of plot. Quote Robert Frost, "The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people." Or put it another way, he landed at the inauguration toward the advancement of a literary empire. Soon after the hurricane, I began to write in Spanish to use myself. So foreign in what seemed domesticity, I was a spick, for I sense all the subjects America had my wildness on me since I was taught His Majesty's language. But I too masticated Spanish over my tongue. I could read the surface of my land, coarse and difficult for me, because home was made such. And that's how I peopled my poems. The people, as I felt them, had a home that could be precarious, but ours. Ricardo, we read your manuscript with great interest, but don't think it's quite right for us or quite ready. We were attracted to its intellectualism, the thinking lyric, its urbanity, but wanted to see something a bit more wild or savage. So was the project of edition that received my work. The words waited for me in 2016 when I inquired about my manuscript, more than a decade after my arrival to New York. More savage, wild, I would be read thus. By nature, the mind wants to argue against and put a word where a word has put us out. That's a funny way of saying it has been an interest of mine to spell out one fact toward poetry for the edification of civics and life. I want to suggest that Rather than a totalizing force, a track could be made or proposed for the chance of poetry as art that makes it porous enough in community to force a different kind of moral accuracy, which is a way of positing value on a particular ground for agility that incites negotiation against Black space. Let me make myself clear. One writes with, even when one writes against. Or as Louis Zukofsky had it, talk is a form of love, let us talk. Literature is therefore an interrogating project that privileges how a lyric may respond to the moral demands of a citizenship in our great unknowing, specifically when utility remains indisputably of course. That truth informs our shared obligations. That may be, on my end, the only project that rings true for the prosody of the medium itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Katie, please.
Thank you. Well, I guess I should say that it is not enviable to follow a poet. My words will not sound as beautiful as Ricardo's. I enjoyed that so much. Well, I'll give a little backstory before I share what I think is probably relevant to this conversation. So for much of my career, all of my career, I have been focused on the intersection of media and entertainment culture and the opportunity for social good and social progress. Sometimes I like to shorthand that work by saying that we can believe a lot in the role of entertainment culture as a dehumanizing force and as a divisive force and as a agent of polarization, and we would be right about all of those things. But if we only said that, we would miss the ways in which entertainment culture writ large also supplies our civic imagination and our ability to see one another and to make the world a bit more just and a bit more kind. And so I would say it's not that I haven't done a lot of research on the ways that particular issues and communities are portrayed in ways that can be dehumanizing in entertainment. I think that's a very well developed body of work that's not just my own, of course. But I have focused really on the positive leveraging of entertainment culture for social change. So the backstory on my comedy work is that I have been working for a number of years in a variety of different contexts. I am trained as a scholar, but I have not just worked in that arena. I was a producer in Hollywood for a number of years for the legendary Norman Lear, who a lot of people know as one of the progenitors of the idea that comedy can be marshaled as a force for conversation and spark dialogue. And I've also produced documentaries and done a lot of really what I would call serious work, right? Serious social justice work through entertainment and media. And a number of years ago, I kind of sat up and thought to myself, why is it that when we think about spaces that, quote, do civil society, human rights, social justice work through entertainment or media in some way, why is it that we tend to, in that sector writ large, only talk about journalism or only talk about serious documentaries? And it seemed that we were really missing a big opportunity to talk about comedy, which in my experience, both as a producer and as a scholar, had so much more to say about the ways that we already engage with one another as humans. But for whatever series of reasons, when it comes to conversations about encouraging public engagement in human rights writ large, we tend to not include comedy or comedians in that conversation. And that really just that curiosity and frankly, kind of frustration on my part, led me to create an entire research agenda and creative agenda that is now a number of different media production projects, the Yes and Laughter Lab, which Hussein mentioned. This curiosity of mine has now produced 2 books about the intersection of comedy and human rights. The most recent one is called, it's actually this year, The Revolution Will Be Hilarious, Comedy for Social Change and Civic Power. Okay, so that's the backstory, but here are a few things that I wanted to share with this community and audience about what I have learned about how comedy is such a unique and meaningful force when it comes to bringing communities together, bringing individuals together to actually hear one another. So I've just jotted down a few notes, a few big picture things, and this is now over 10 years of studying and doing, if you will, this topic. A couple of things that I would want to mention, and I'll just name them up top and then go into a few details about each one. One is about comedy as a rhetorical form and how it's created and why that engineering of comedy itself is already predisposed to this kind of humanizing, bringing people together. I suppose I should use the word civility, which I will do. I usually use different terms like public engagement, but I think that we're generally speaking about the same ideals. So comedy is rhetoric and why it works, what it is about comedy that actually makes us laugh. The second, which I think is often really not talked about, so I'm really excited to mention it, is the actual creative process by which comedy is produced and the deviance inside it, which is so important for this, the actual creative process. And then, of course, what we might think of as perhaps the number one thing I might talk about, which is comedy's influence on audiences when we're talking about civic and civil and human rights issues. So first, let's think about comedy and humor and why it works actually as a form. So comedy at its very earliest juncture, we think was defined, at least at some early stage, by Aristotle. If you were my grad students, I would say to you, he's very, very, very old. But what's meaningful about what Aristotle had to say about comedy was he observed it as a societal function. It was not meant just for entertainment purposes. Comedy was actually always meant to be a societal corrective, to actually point out what is so absurd or grotesque that it deserves to be lampooned and therefore corrected. So comedy as a societal corrective has always been the case, and we have always needed comedians in many different cultures for not only social critique, but of course, resilience and catharsis. So what is it about why we actually laugh? So if you think about joke structure, for example, or even when someone is just being funny and it's not necessarily a formal joke. Thinking about joke structure alone, a funny person sets up a premise. You have to have some shared cultural recognition to at least buy into that premise or to understand what it is that the funny person is talking about. But then here's where the deviance comes in. There is incongruity, which is the punchline. And so this actually is the idea that we set up a reality, we then bend the reality, i.e. we make you see it differently. You have to see it with a different lens. And the incongruity of what is and what the joke has just made it is what makes us laugh. So in fact, the reason we laugh in the first place is because we have been forced, even for a tiny joke, to see something outside of the lens or the calcified way that that topic is often talked about. So I love that because I love talking about comedy as deviance. So we literally have to shift our lens to even get the joke. And so it requires us to see outside of ourselves. The second brief topic, just to orient to today in comedy in this topic, is about the creativity involved in making comedy. So there is, of course, before I talk about comedy, I should say, with great passion, that no social problem in human history has ever been solved without creativity. Creativity gave us electricity. It gave us cars. I could go on and on about the machines that creativity has given us, because I think we can understand that really broadly conceptually. But no great social challenge in humanity has been solved without sometimes radical creativity. And so when we think about comedy, comedy is created itself by this wild, open, creative process. Comedy requires that we take cues from all areas of life. Observational comedy, if anyone has ever gone to a great stand-up comedy show and watched someone riff about the 10 minutes that it took them to get there and do all the observational work, that is about taking cues from even the mundanity, which actually is life, right? Creativity in comedy actually requires people who are called, in the world of psychology, divergent thinkers. So they must be able to actually see outside of the usual boundaries of things. There is an absolute need for diversity in every way, diversity of lived experience, of lens, in order for comedy to actually be funny. And here's the really, really important part. Comedy, especially when it comes to civility, comedy requires what I call radical listening. I'll just set this up for you in case that seems abstract. If you are in an improv team, you cannot perform in the team if you are not listening so hard with your body and your soul and your creativity, because otherwise the scene will fall flat. So this radical listening, this is true in comedy writers' rooms. It is true in observational stand-up comedy. The radical listening to the pulse of life and to one's fellow creative people is a requirement. And the final one is absolutely the need for failure. Comedians, by the time you have seen them perform, they have worked a joke sometimes 20 times with a different inflection, a different audience, a different body movement, a different outfit, a different accent, a prop. So that failure is part of the radical listening. And the final piece that I'll just touch on before I completely go over on my time is that we know from so much research across disciplines, not only my own field in media and communication, which itself borrows from every other field, including religion, sociology, psychology, performance art, public health, the hard sciences. Comedy actually, fun fact for anyone who's like a big nerd listening today, comedy is one of our cultural forces that is truly studied in almost every discipline that we can think of. I find that alone quite fun and exciting, that we can all come at what is it about this magical force of comedy that's so meaningful across disciplines. But what we know across disciplines, and I know this because I've written about it in a couple of different books, not just my research, but synthesizing many, many other scholars from other disciplines, that comedy as a genre, when it comes to sharing messages and encouraging public engagement in civic, social, and public health issues, we know that comedy is sometimes uniquely able to cut through topics that are taboo, that are painful, that are difficult to otherwise talk about, to cut through cultural differences. Comedy is more likely to be shared, and therefore amplifying original messages, representation, et cetera, et cetera. So the final thing that I'll just close on when it comes to the way that my mind thinks about comedy and this topic of bringing communities together, or productive dialogue, civic dialogue, civility, is three big ideas that I would just love to leave this discussion with, which is what I get most excited about when I think about comedy as a force for this work. I think in three different ways that kind of bring a lot of those big macro ideas together. One, of course, is comedy as social critique, which I've always talked about. Comedians really show us what is absurdly wrong and grotesque in an unjust society and what needs fixing. This is incredibly important. This is a little bit of a watchdog function. The second is comedy as the idea of cultural citizenship, which I love. This actually comes from Chicano studies in the 80s. And of course, many beautiful theories are designed for us to borrow and play with and make special and new. But this is the idea that our contemporary media environment does not introduce us to the full array of lived experiences in our beautifully pluralistic culture, and entire groups of people can have quote unquote benefits of citizenship. They can vote and work and pay taxes, but may be culturally invisible. The reason that comedy is meaningful in all of that is because comedy allows us to bring ourselves with our full flaws and our humanity. And that is actually where we find our shared humanity, not with perfect people, but with people that are messy. And then the final idea, and I always end with this one on purpose, is comedy as the idea of civic imagination. That ultimately, for social good and civility and shared dialogue, it is really difficult to just go about this work if we are only angry and we are only full of rage. We can't yet see what the world is like when it's better if that's the emotional range. That comedy allows us the idea of imagining the world as better and more playful and more optimistic. And therefore, that is the civic imagination idea, that we want to imagine the world as it could be, not just fatigue ourselves with, by the way, required anger. I'm not saying anger and rage is not meaningful. It fuels me a lot, especially on Mondays. But comedy as civic imagination is incredibly important. So that is all that I have to say. And I hope that maybe if there were any skeptics in the room that thought, why not take comedy seriously? Hopefully I've piqued one's interest in those ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Please, virtually, can we give a round of applause to both Ricardo and Katie for the work that they've done. Thank you both for having this lovely conversation. And, I'm just taken with how artful you both were in your presentation. Obviously, Ricardo is offering a lyrical moment, and Katie is telling us this really wonderful story. For those of you who understand academia, good narrative is hard to find. And Katie, you gave us a great story. You ended with this civic imagination, but that's also how you began, which pop culture provides our civic imagination. And ending with that, I think I'm just taken with the artfulness. I'm going to repeat myself. I'm just taken with the artfulness both of you provided, because I think it is a wonderful embodiment of what I understood both of you trying to do with your work. That this was not an intellectual exercise. This is an embodied exercise for you both. And I'm deeply appreciative of that. I wish I had that skill. So rather than having that skill, what I'm going to do is try to bridge some things that I saw across both talks and see if I can get you to think deeply in each other's views, or perhaps that's not the right way, but have you think more deeply, provoking you with each other's thoughts. And one of the things, Katie, that you said was thinking about how in comedy there is this perspective shift, the incongruity that is the punchline, so that generates a perspective shift to see outside of ourselves. And I think this is not something I heard you expressly speak to, Ricardo, but I think implicit in your own work is that poetry by its economy forces a reader or a listener to position themselves in the poet's worldview. I mean, I think this is true for any literature, but I think because of the economy of words of poetry, you're forced to, which is why the powerful poems are the 3-line poems and the 3-page poems, right? And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about perspective shifting in poetry.
Yes, I do, but I want to go back to a point that Kathy, you made earlier. It reminds me the real need for playfulness, right, as strategy for writing and seeing the world. I was invited to be a part of Canto Mundo, which is this terrific workshop for Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx poets. And I got to spend 3 hours with Ada Limon, who is now the Poet Laureate of the United States. And her strategy was particularly transformative because as we walked in, she said to us, we are being asked to perform a very specific way in our poems. There is a market for our stories, or a very specific kind of story that we can tell. But where does that leave joy? Where does that leave levity? They are emotions that should be investigated and by the poet. And that's something that I guess it had never crossed my mind, the fact that these are generative sentiments that require deep and thoughtful consideration on the part of a poet who is constantly asked to perform, say in my case, the Maria narrative, right? I just did it tonight as well, right? It's kind of a compulsion to try to shift perspectives of those who are engaging with me as an administrator, but also as someone who has a project, trying to get them to understand the totality of me, something that they can't generally parse by just, say, reading a poem or reading a press statement by my office, right?
Someone gave me a laugh, Ricardo. Yes, the press statement alone does not do it.
But yeah, I mean, the poem is built to shift perspectives. Formally so. We are marking time, constantly asking the reader to shift how they look, how they see, as we move from line to line, as we negotiate things like white space versus print.
Thank you, Ricardo, for both sets of comments. Katie, for me, and again, go in whatever direction you want. Obviously, I'm not invested in what I'm asking, but I'm trying to generate some ideas. Is as you're talking about comedy and the way comedy functions, and I'm listening to Ricardo's poem, which is shifting these emotional tones, I'm reminded of one of my favorite sitcoms, which is MASH. I love MASH, and there are two things that I'm struck about MASH.
Mhm.
One is season 1 introduces a character, or has a character by the name of Spear Chucker, who, there's some severely racist overtones that don't fit into, I think, the vision of what MASH wants to be. And they quickly adjust by season 2, and you have a very different sort of narrative arc and series of narratives behind it. And I think there's a coherence to comedy that people don't realize. Like it builds and it develops, and I don't think people appreciate that. So I'd love your reflections on that. But the other thing is, in terms of thinking about shifts in tones, and I'm going to say spoiler alert here, even though MASH has been off the air for decades at this point, but I feel like I just need to do it, is, some of the most powerful episodes for me in MASH are the ones where there is this tonal shift, where Henry Blake dies. That episode is still sticks with me when Radar O'Reilly leaves, and what he leaves behind is his gifts for his people in the camp, right? Like those tonal shifts stick with me so much more, perhaps because it has been a comedy up until that point, and those moments of pathos really surge. But I just, if you could talk a little bit about, people think comedy is always laughing, but there's other work that happens there.
Pathos. Yeah, a couple of different, I think maybe 2 points that I would want to make there. One is contemporary, and one is a Norman Lear story. So if you like MASH, I'm sure you watched All in the Family. So similar, same jacket. So so this is a Norman story, not mine, but I think it really answers your question. So as I mentioned, I was a producer and philanthropy director with Norman Lear for many years. And I like to joke, especially if he sees this, I've heard every story Norman Lear tells. I have heard he's a very fun human, which I think you would hope he would be for the kind of entertainment he made. But sometimes our heroes don't end up being great. But Norman actually is an exceptional human. So he tells a story, and then it's in a famous episode. So All in the Family, for people who don't know about it, was the story of a sort of cartoonishly bigoted character, a patriarch, Archie Bunker. Archie Bunker actually was the satire. So he was so over the top that Norman Lear intended him and drew him as the ability to poke fun at all of the isms, right? He was racist, he was sexist, he was homophobic, he was ridiculous. And he was surrounded by these characters that were the redeeming characters, right? Edith, his wife, a beloved, lovely, salt of the earth person, and then Meathead, who was played by Rob Reiner, who became a successful director, was like the voice of, progressive sensibility, and his wife, Gloria. Okay, so that's the setup. And I probably didn't even need to do that, but very quickly. So in an episode of All in the Family, speaking to your point, Hussein, about the highs and lows, when you can laugh with a character, or you can laugh with a comedian, and really find joy and commonality, the tragedy that can come is deep, I would say, is more deeply felt. So in an episode of All in the Family from the 70s, Edith has a dear friend who is queer, and there is a tragic incident, and I can't remember whether her friend is killed or seriously injured, but it breaks Edith's heart. Edith is just broken. Her heart is completely broken. And Norman would say, and has said, well, she was the soul of the show. And so she held for us as the audience why that should hurt so much. And even after watching, Archie say all his stuff over the episodes of, in order to sort of point out the absurdity. So that's one piece, the deep sorrow that can come when you have found love, through comedy, through shared humanity. Another story, this might sound a little bit like a little off the beaten path, but there's a comedian that I work with a lot named Corey Ryan Forrester. He's part of a trio of comedians. He's his own performer, but he wrote a book with two other comedians and sometimes tours with a group, and they call themselves the Liberal Rednecks. And they wrote a book called The Liberal Redneck Manifesto, which is very funny. So Corey Ryan Forrester, very briefly, is a white, heterosexual, Southern, born and bred many generations, comedian who lives in the northern part of Georgia, that is quite rural and historically very conservative, Bible Belt, the whole thing. And so Corey, by his own admission, says, well, I look like a really particular kind of person. I have a thick Southern accent that is from Georgia. It's real specific. I tell jokes about certain things, but he says, you know what? I can go into communities that look and sound and feel like me, but might believe in different things than me, and they will be with me for the comedy that I'm going to do. And so when he does, he'll do, a stand-up comedy routine in the heart of, Alabama, Georgia, et cetera. Not painting a broad brush with any of these areas, but just talking about the sort of broad band of conservatism. And he says, look, I'll do a bunch of jokes about like my mama, and you have a mama, and I have a mama, you have a papa, I have a papa. Also, I'm lactose intolerant. Let me tell some fart jokes. And then 40 minutes in, he'll do an anti-homophobia joke or a joke that takes on structural racism. And he says, at that point, even if they've never thought about it that way, they're with me a little bit. And he says, there's never a time, almost never a time, when someone doesn't come up to me after and say, I had actually not thought about that until you said it that way. So it's not that, as I wrote in my book, so I'm not stealing any quotes here. This is in my book called Revolution Will Be Hilarious. That's very tacky of me, but there it is. It looks like Dr. Seuss. But Corey says, and I quoted, he says, listen, I cannot get a whole community of people to come to my critical race theory TED Talk. And by the way, not that there shouldn't be, not pitting them against each other, but I can get a whole lot of people to come listen to me do comedy for an hour. And I might talk about that and you might learn something about it. So I'm never saying that comedy is the only cultural force, because sometimes depending on the listener, I say, oh, are you saying that we don't need that? No, we need all of it, right? We need all the art. Not just journalism, we need art. But we need comedy. And I just to wrap it up with where your question began, Hussein, I think when we have experienced through and you've experienced this through MASH for sure, pretty intense parasocial relationships there with the characters, but you love them so much because you've watched them be flawed and ridiculous. And then the tragedy is that we can feel, I was interrupting myself with my own sentence that came out of my head. Let me just stop this sentence and do another one. Sometimes I think that comedy offers something different than empathy. Empathy is incredibly meaningful, and there are lots of ways that media and entertainment generate that, of course. But sometimes I think solidarity might be the mission and the goal, because solidarity says, I actually see you as just as human as me, because we are flawed and we are messy and we make mistakes and we all are not 100% good all the time. But when I can see you that way, instead of just as a hero or a villain, which is empathy, right? If I can experience solidarity with you, I think that means that we're believing in one another's absolute shared humanity, not just I'm better than you, I pity you, I'm so glad I'm not you, all of those things that we might accidentally do when we say we are practicing empathy. Sometimes we might be practicing what I would call, I'm so sorry for you, but that doesn't look anything like my life. Shared humanity says we really are all humans in the same way. And when we can see each other's funny bits, I think it makes that proposition a little bit easier.
Great. So I'm not going to abuse moderator's privilege to keep asking you questions. Do either one of you have questions or comments on the other that you want to probe? No obligation.
I definitely want Ricardo to be my friend. So
We can make that happen very easily. I'm a fan of convening generally, because isn't that civics, right? Like, isn't that how we create meaning together? I like to approach the world as if I don't really know much. Therefore, I am forced to seek more. And therefore let that knowledge prism itself onto me, right? And teach me something I never expected to be aware of. And I think that's generally what brought me to poetry, that not knowing, which I experienced early on. I guess I want to ask if you could provide us some insight into, as someone who's so devoted to comedy as an essential engine of human experience and expression, what drew you to it?
Oh, Ricardo, would you believe that almost no one asked me that question? Isn't that funny? Because it's not, yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if I don't know, well, because no one's asked me, so I don't have a great answer for it. But let me just try something that I know is true in my own soul, which is, so my family comes from the South of the United States. And I always am quick to say I don't have a Southern accent because my dad was in the Air Force and I grew up all over the world. So I don't feel like I'm from a place, but my people are Southern. And wow, are they storytellers? Everybody in my family is loud, and the whole goal of a gathering is to tell you the latest funny story about something dumb that they did. So it's very self-deprecating. In my family, at least, it's never at someone else's expense. There's a lot of telling funny stories about that time I did that crazy thing and that thing happened. So I grew up around that, and I never thought about that as a sort of cultural way, only because I feel so outside my own culture, because I grew up all over the country and all over the world. So I'm like, I don't know, am I Southern? Am I not Southern? Are my people? I don't know. But they all are loud and funny and storytellers. And so I'm just going to go ahead and say, yes, those are my people. And also, Ricardo, I was a very funny little kid. And I was in trouble a lot for not doing what I was supposed to be doing, like telling jokes in class, or, wearing deliberately the wrong thing to the dance recital so I could be like the clown. And so I wrote this in the foreword of my book that I was interested in comedy for lots of reasons as a scholar and a producer. But I realized, I think all along, maybe I wanted to understand my own use of comedy to find my place in the world as a kid who didn't feel like she belonged anywhere, maybe. So maybe that's it. See, you could write a beautiful, beautiful poem about that.
I love it. I love that answer. You mentioned, right, that you were able to have these conversations with your family, right? And use comedy in those exchanges. And like my fear with comedy is that generally it puts me at the site of discomfort, and it's not the fault of the comedian. Mostly it's I feel like it's the site, that discomfort is the site of like where the heart needs to do work.
Wow.
So
I'm going to reflect on that.
but that's a quick thought, right? I always, I guess my psychotherapist would ask me why was that uncomfortable, and then try to tie that to some sort of personal narrative I have created about myself, for my own purposes.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine your poetry might have come from a space also of making sense of the world and your space in it and how you see the world in a certain way. I see the world as a constant way to play. I really cannot sit in meetings and not disrupt people, because everything is the chance. I'm not a comedian, by the way. I just write this stuff. But to me, everything is an opportunity to tell a joke, do an aside, I can't, that is who I've been since I was 5. So it kind of makes sense. But I wonder if your poetry feels the same for you. It's like grounding you. And
yeah, there's an elastic quality to language. Poems, I feel like, are everywhere. We see them all the time, and it's a matter of netting it, right? When I can't write, I remember what Tracy K. Smith said once, which is, when one is not writing, one is listening. And that has been very instructive to me. And I guess it just ties to that unknowing, right? Like, what is the language of the world throwing at me, and how I can make some sense out of it. It's interesting because I keep trying to account for my presentation, which in many ways felt somewhat sad, but my goal in writing a poem is to be funny in ways people don't read it as such. I write to humor myself, whatever that may mean. And when an audience member responds to it favorably, that's when I know I did something right.
Yes. Love that. Love that. I'll just add one parting thought that sort of connects to that, Ricardo, but just to do your job for you is, when we think about just really big picture, when we think about this notion of civility and radical listening and how we can see one another, I'm in so many different environments that are, academia, or I'm in activism communities or media making communities. I live in lots of different professional communities. And it's really obvious that the communities that don't manage to progress in diverse thinking or new ideas are the ones that have stripped the play right out of it. I just find it very hard to imagine that human beings can listen to one another disagree if they haven't started with some form of play. It doesn't have to be comedy with a capital C, doesn't have to be poetry with a capital P, but some form of play. We start almost every meeting that I run with, if it's 15 people, 20 people, the ones where we all look like we're dead in the eyes, but we start them and go around and say something. One of my favorite prompts is, what is one piece of daily joy that you experienced today? And daily joy is different from big joy. Like big joy will be when my son graduates from high school and I get that kid into college, right? That's not daily joy. That's like big joy that we're working hard at. But my daily joy is a poodle that walks by the front, my office window every day and has on a different sweater. I mean, it's hilarious. And the poodle thinks that she is a person. And there's something whimsical in that. And I promise by the time you invite a whole group of people to play for 6 minutes, what happens differently, as I like to say, is the energy in the space changes. I'm not so ignorant that I'm saying this is the panacea to all of our deep, shared, horribly painful problems. But it is a kind of basic idea about who we are as humans, that we learned how to play before we learned how to do anything else. And the idea of listening to someone radically disagree with you and having no space where you've played, I don't see how we get past that. So I guess that would be my soapbox closer.
That is a wonderful closer, Katie, for all of us. We began with me talking about what is civility and coming back to notions of belonging and citizenship, and having both of you walk us through how the arts play a role in that civil discourse, and talking about cultural citizenship, talking about belonging. So I'm going to match them up and call it cultural belonging.
Ooh.
But really, this is what we're aiming for through our work, our various projects and our various works through the arts, and engaging in public discourse and encouraging those ideas of civil society and civility amongst each other, and sitting in that space of discomfort and recognizing that it's also play. So I want to thank you both for walking us through this process, engaging with me, with each other, with all of our audience members. Deeply, deeply appreciative. Thank you both. Can we please, in the audience, join us in another round of applause for Katie and Ricardo. This is the last panel in the Civility Project series, but we are working on an edited volume. So as Katie's holding up her book, we will, next time you see us, be holding up a volume where we've all contributed to it. And hopefully, Ricardo, that means I get to read your wonderful poem as well. I'm so enamored of some of the lines in that. And Katie, some of your thoughts on the 3 purposes of comedy. With that, I want to thank the audience, the Brademas Center, and again, once more, our panelists for their time this evening. Thank you all.
Thank you. Let's take the show on the road, Katie.
Woo! I love it. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
You too.